Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating textual mystery from a piece of analysis titled Thoughts in Isolation. We're basically exploring what happens when you take a suppressed ancient manuscript and line it up side by side with a canonical biblical book. It's a comparison that really challenges how history is preserved, how it's interpreted, and sometimes how it's actually weaponized by the exact same institutions guarding it. So, let's get right into it. Okay, the author starts us off with a pretty bold premise regarding a lost text from Cochin, India. It's known as the Words of Gad the Seer. According to the source, this manuscript contains a profound historical and theological indictment. It's a text the author argues was purposely kept well beyond the reach of European councils, the historical figures who basically decided what the world was and wasn't allowed to read. But the claim here isn't just about this one isolated book. It's actually about what this book echoes. Now, a fair skeptic might say, well, a suppressed book is just a disputed standalone text, right? It's easy to shrug off. But the author's central hook is this. What if it doesn't stand alone? What if this contested manuscript from India mirrors, almost perfectly, the shortest book in the entire Hebrew Bible, the book of Obadiah? The source essentially argues that we're looking at two witnesses giving the exact same testimony. But before we look at that comparison, we really need to know who is actually on trial here. The absolutely crucial term for this is Edom. Historically, Edom was an Iron Age kingdom carved right into the rocks of Seir. But here is the major twist. The source points out that in ancient Jewish tradition, going all the way back to the Talmudic period, Edom is interpreted as more than just that ancient kingdom. It represents Rome and eventually European Christendom. You're going to want to keep that in mind because it's the interpretive key that unlocks this whole analysis. All right, so here is the author's methodology. We compare the witnesses. On one side, we have the words of God the Seer, that suppressed text from India, and on the other, the book of Obadiah, which is just 21 canonical verses long, but aimed squarely at Edom. The source argues that when you actually set God beside Obadiah, they interlock perfectly. It's like they're ancient tally sticks. They literally share the same boast, the same sentence, the same crime, the same map, and the exact same ending. Let's start by looking at that shared boast. In Obadiah, Edom claims an unreachable mountain fortress, right? A nest among the stars. But Gad's text escalates this to a whole new level. Gad's Edom claims exclusive knowledge of the God of gods. The author argues that what we are seeing here is Edom's arrogance maturing. It shifts from a physical, military boast of no one can reach me to a massive theological boast of no one but me can reach him. Because of that boast, a judgment is pronounced. But notice the target here. In both of these texts, the judgment doesn't fall on Edom's massive wealth, its military might, or those impenetrable walls. It falls squarely on Edom's intellect. And the source notes this is no accident. Historically, if you look at texts like Jeremiah and Job, Edom was proverbially famous among the nations for its wisdom. So the judgment is uniquely tailored to strike at the pride of the intellect. So who exactly are these wise men of Edom? Well, the author maps this directly onto the early church fathers. We're talking about heavy hitters like Justin the Philosopher, Origen of Alexandria, Tertullian, and Augustine. The source describes the entire patristic project as fundamentally a wisdom project. It was this deeply confident claim to understand the divine architecture better than anybody else, mostly by using Greek metaphysics. Which brings us to the actual sentence handed down. Gad declares that because Edom rose up so high speaking of God, it's actually going to perish in its own cleverness. Obadiah echoes this identically, asking, "Shall I not destroy the wise men out of Edom?" The very thing Edom boasted about, its superior theology and intellect, is exactly what is appointed to perish in both of these ancient manuscripts. But, a judgment requires a crime, doesn't it? Obadiah explicitly states, "For thy violence against thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee." The source emphasizes that the true core scandal here revolves around the word brother. This isn't framed as a standard war between foreign nations. It's framed entirely as a deep fraternal betrayal between twins, Esau and Jacob. Let's break down the specific chronological sequence of these crimes. Esau didn't just go out and fight Jacob. First, he stood by and merely looked on his brother's calamity. Then, he rejoiced over the ruin. Next, he spoke proudly in the day of distress. And finally, he actively stood in the crossway to cut off the escapees. It's a pretty chilling progression when you think about it, moving from a passive observer to a joyful, active participant in the ruin.
and a source maps this exact sequence directly onto the actions of early Christian fathers during Rome's destruction of Judea in 70 and 135 CE. According to the author, men like Eusebius didn't mourn their fallen brother. Instead, they rejoiced over the ruined temple, pointing to it as divine vindication, absolute proof that God had rejected Israel. But Obadiah, verse by verse, strictly forbids that exact response.
The consequence for this is strict measure for measure. Obadiah 15 reads, "As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee." The author actually views the idea that the church replaced Israel, a concept known as supersuccessionism, as a theological reversal of the famous Genesis birthright story. It's almost like the elder brother Esau standing over a ruined Jacob, declaring the blessing was his all along. Obadiah's response is simply that the scales will be forcefully balanced.
Amazingly, the parallels even extend to geography. Obadiah closes out by locating the exiles in places like Zarephath and Sepharad. Gad's text lists these exact same locations, but then it actually expands the map, adding Ashkenaz and Germania. Gad essentially takes Obadiah's geographic layout and pulls it directly north, pointing the finger straight into Europe.
Now, you might be thinking that reading Obadiah's map as Europe is just some modern stretch, but it's actually an ancient Jewish tradition. Ancient Aramaic texts, like the Targum and Jonathan, translate Zarephath as France and Sepharad as Spain. This is exactly why Spanish Jewry is historically called Sephardic and German Jewry is Ashkenazic. The suppressed book and the canonical book are operating off the exact same historical map.
And naturally, as you'd expect by now, they share the exact same ending. In Gad, the robbed overcome the robber, and the kingdom is Yahweh's. Over in Obadiah, Zion is delivered, Esau is judged, and the kingdom is the Lord's. It is one completely unified verdict echoing across two entirely different texts.
All right, now we hit the real narrative climax of this explainer because this is where the source drops the ultimate irony. The author argues that the institution that preserved Obadiah, the church itself, is the very institution being indicted by it. The exact same body that carefully, painstakingly canonized the text is the target of its prophetic judgment. Let that sink in. And the historical evidence the author provides for this is honestly pretty striking. Obadiah was kept in Athanasius's famous Festal Letter. It was formally ratified at the councils of Hippo and Carthage. It was translated into Latin by Jerome's own hand. For 17 centuries, these 21 verses of pure indictment against Edom sat incredibly comfortably inside approved scriptures, being read aloud in churches everywhere. So how exactly did they manage to live with a text that was essentially aimed right at their own front door? The author explains that they diffused it through interpretation. Edom was either historicized into a dead kingdom buried under the sand, or it was allegorized into just the carnal man, a moral abstraction with no real-world address. By completely controlling the interpretation, the prophecy was made to apply to anyone except the readers themselves. Which really leaves us with this profound final thought from the author. It suggests that true control of a text doesn't actually mean burning it, because, well, that just leaves ashes as evidence. Real control is holding the interpretive key so tightly that the words can sit right out in the open, on a lectern, literally pronouncing judgment, and yet never truly be heard. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other mysteries are out there, hiding in plain sight, just waiting to be read without their traditional filters? Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.